This here is a marvellous clip from a much longer, also marvellous, interview between the historian Niall Ferguson and Jordan Peterson. The clip is only 15 minutes long or so. I can't recommend it enough. Niall Ferguson is a historian at the Hoover Institute and also at Harvard and Stanford University, which is quite a storied resume. He speaks in the clip here about how German elites became technocrats and uncoupled from ethics. I want to say here that I agree with the fundamentals of his analysis and what Jordan Peterson adds to the discussion about the rise of National Socialism and of Hitler. But I do think they're missing something. Again, I want to emphasize that I basically only have praise for what they say in this brief clip. That is from a much longer interview, but I want to fill in what I see as an important gap in what they do say. Let's begin with the fact that Jordan B. Peterson is quite right when he says he was always dissatisfied with the explanations he was given as an undergraduate at university, namely that it was economics that explained Hitler's rise. It's true, there were severe punishments imposed on Germany after World War I. These were known as the Treaty of Versailles. And many of the most common mainstream takes on this that you get in history textbooks put down the rise of Nazism and Hitler to this economic factor, the so-called humiliation of the Germans by the Allied victors at the end of World War I. But it's just not the explanation. It's a minor factor in the whole scheme of things. Humiliation is not enough to turn people into genocidal maniacs. So what does explain the rise of National Socialism? If it's not economics, what is it? It's ideas. And on this, Niall and Jordan and myself converge. But Niall emphasises, and indeed really puts it down to Hitler's unique charisma, among other things. His demonic appeal, as he calls it. So in other words, the method of delivery of those ideas is what he is really holding up as the main factor. In fact, he says that what Hitler managed to do was, quote, tap into demonic strains in German culture, end quote. Now, this gets closer to the mark, but he doesn't explore this much, at least not in the interview, so I don't think his analysis ultimately goes deep enough. A couple of things he never mentions, but which are key here, is required, to my mind. It's the memes, and those rest on bad philosophy, which the German Academy was absolutely swimming in. That is the demonic strain running through German culture. But Niall says that educated German men were persuaded by Hitler to renounce Christian ethics, and so they took up a form of barbarism instead. Okay, so it's true they became barbaric, and it's true they renounced an important tradition, Christianity, which was a moderating force on barbarism. But it cannot simply be Hitler's charisma. Why was Hitler's audience so susceptible to his charisma or his skill as an orator, which is another way Niall and Jordan put it? Jordan, of course, calls on Nietzsche and the death of God hypothesis, the end of religion, in other words, to explain the decline in moral standards. Okay, I can accept that is part of the reason. But basically people are devoted Christians or Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists to the extent they are not critical. And if you begin from a place not critical, you may be inclined, to my mind, to more easily move to another uncritical place. We see it today with the move away from traditional religion, perhaps caused in large part by the new atheist movement, and into the space of woke ideology or political dogmatism, the modern communist and environmental movements. But anyways, it is because for all their education, these elites in Germany were not, and perhaps never were, sufficiently critical. But why? And why is that the case today? Why are people insufficiently critical of ideology, whether religious or secular? Namely, political and environmental, or even technological right now, as is fashionable, the AI eschatology say. Well, people are insufficiently critical because of anti-rational memes. And where do those originate? Yes, many are ancient and unconscious, but we cannot overlook the role of bad philosophy. In particular, the Germans in the form of Heidegger, Hegel, and even Jordan's great hero, Friedrich Nietzsche, as well as someone who is often lauded as a great voice of the Enlightenment, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer may have emphasized compassion, for example, but only in the context of a pessimism about people, namely that we are driven this way and that by the will, which he did not see as free, but rather as base desires and irrational and aimless. So you've got to have compassion for people because, hey, they're not in control of themselves, they're irrational. And, of course, Heidegger was closely associated with the Nazi Party and he was a supporter of Hitler. And Hegel was an influence on Marx, but he can't be blamed for Marx, of course. But his was an impenetrable style. He had a lack of clarity, and that's one of the philosophers emblematic of the criticism I have of philosophers in general when set against someone like Karl Popper. But here we can basically say that Heidegger's, view that history was teleological, which means there was an ultimate end point for history, that it's all heading in a particular direction, so to speak. History can be seen, on his view, as a way of perfecting things. That idea animated and inspired Marxism, as well as its offshoots of Nazism and fascism as well. And Heidegger was authoritarian. Anyways, this kind of thing, the panoply of bad ideas from the philosophers I just mentioned, from the nihilism of Nietzsche through to the pessimism of Heidegger and everything in between, runs through German culture because the culture is downstream of the academic work and traditions in any society. And as much as the man on the street, so to speak, might want to deny academics in ivory towers don't influence their thinking, the fact is, what happens is that intellectuals like philosophers inform other academics who teach teachers, who teach future politicians, who enact laws, and it becomes culture. And thus, the common man does indeed become enculturated with the ideas of the intellectuals eventually. It takes much less than a generation for all this to happen. And of course, we've got the French philosophers too. But that will take me too far away from our main point, which is a phalanx of purveyors of bad ideas who were saturating the very air of the educated person in German society. This is the fertile academic ground into which Hitler stepped. Yes, there was grievance after their treatment in World War I. Okay. But many people are aggrieved, and many throughout history, many societies become aggrieved, but most don't become genocidal. We do see it today, both religious grievance and political grievance and so on. With the Germans after World War I, it was not so much a religious grievance. It was motivated instead by secular philosophy. This is why National Socialism spread so effectively through Germany. It required a critical mass of academics and intellectuals, and then the foot soldiers of students to make the case in the universities and on the streets, which then attracted another critical mass of workers and regular families. It became the smart thing to be and to do, agitate for National Socialism. Jordan and Niall speak of how Nazism went viral. And that's the right word, of course. The mind virus, as Gad Saad and others have called these ideas, and how they spread. Or better yet, to my mind, memes, ideas that survive. And in particular, anti-rational memes that switch off critical faculties in the minds of their holders, so all kinds of regular but terrible irrationalities can take hold. But all of this occurs in an environment of bad philosophy. Never say philosophy doesn't matter or is irrelevant or only science makes the difference in a society. No, it's philosophy that is logically prior to all that. All science, all thinking. Whether one thinks they have a philosophy or knows what it is, they have one. It directs their every utterance and what ideas they are susceptible to. You don't need to be conscious of what your philosophy is for it to motivate your behavior. Niall speaks eloquently about how the crescendo of a Hitler speech seems mad out of context. The context of the opera, as he calls it. The demagoguery needs to be understood. That all societies can be led into unfreedom, as he says. How? By the fact the Nazi economy was more prosperous than the Weimar, what came before. Propaganda, and finally, coercion, which starts in a targeted way, the coercion, and then becomes a blanket application of force across society. But this happens progressively. These three forces, where you have some ideology pointing to more prosperity for some, I would say, propaganda, and finally coercion, explain how even advanced societies can fall into authoritarianism and madness. You need those three things: prosperity, propaganda, and coercion, Niall says. I couldn't agree more. Niall is absolutely correct in this clip when you listen to it. Teaching how all of that works, this fall into authoritarianism, is absent from university education to a large degree, perhaps entirely. So a generation of young people do not understand, much less realize, when they fall into these behaviors. So thank goodness for Jordan B. Peterson and his guest there. And thank goodness for YouTube and X that promote this. And thank goodness for AirChat. We can now spread these ideas even further. Because if the universities won't do it, we must in forums like this one.